good. Nah, we're good, buddy. All right, Bill, you're good to go. Your seat, Pete.
That might topple. Good morning, everyone. Moral courage is, by definition, acting on principle in the face of adverse consequences. The American presidency is filled with examples of moral heroism. George Washington stepping down after 2 terms despite a fear of anarchy. Teddy Roosevelt standing up to robber barons to advance a progressive agenda. Lyndon Johnson pursuing the Voting Rights Act in 1965, knowing it would hurt the Democratic Party for a generation. When politics are deeply polarized, courage between and across tribes adds depth to these acts. Or, as Arthur Brooks of the American Enterprise Institute recently said, moral courage is the act of defending someone with whom you disagree politically. A generation ago, Texas Democrat Jim Hightower said this somewhat differently. The only thing in the middle of the road is a yellow stripe and dead armadillos. Pete Wehner's new book, The Death of Politics, is at its core a book about moral courage in both senses, obeying principles and embracing opponents. Pete is a New York Times contributing op-ed writer, a contributing editor covering American politics and conservative thought for The Atlantic, and a popular commentator on politics. He's also a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a veteran of 3 Republican administrations, Reagan and both Bushes. And we've been blessed to have him here regularly at the Miller Center in the 5 years that I've been director. He's participated in the Bush 43 Oral History Project and has appeared here on this stage at least twice, as well as at PresFest in May. And I'm particularly proud to call him a friend. He joins us today to discuss his new book, The Death of Politics. The book is a timely lesson in civics and democratic virtues, in the balance of power, in integrity and accountability, but also in political morality, namely in individual liberties, civic responsibilities, public service, and truth in politics. The book is a cry for hope. Despite its title about the death of politics, it's a case for courage that asks us to accept the challenges of engaging with one another. His book provides us with a map of what politics at its best has been in American history and what it can be going forward. He asks us to think about what might constitute a renewed commitment to truth and what kind of leader can help get us there. Most importantly, Pete argues it is not merely a change of leadership, but a change of citizenship, of what we ourselves do. His book is a cry for a more fluent civic literacy, for us to continue to educate ourselves in our history and in current affairs, and to improve our civic knowledge and democratic focus. He asks us not to lose trust in the process of governing, in the practice of politics, in the legitimacy of reporting facts, and in the effectiveness of democracy. So I'm really thrilled that Pete has agreed to join us today. I'll do a lot more thanks at the end, since this is our last event of the semester, and also give you a preview of what we have for next semester. But I simply want to thank one person for this, which is Claire Keeler, and I don't see Claire. Maybe she's here, maybe she's not. Claire was my summer intern. I wrote a review of this book this summer when we were trying to get Pete to come. And Claire did a terrific job in helping me prepare for that. This is a culmination of a lot of work, but we should acknowledge one of our great UVA students. So with that, I'm going to turn the stage over to Pete.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Bill, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back. I just want to say a word about Bill, who is a friend and something of a confidant, somebody that I would go to in an instant to try and get counsel when wisdom is needed. I just want to say publicly what a wonderful job you've done with the Miller Center. You know, we live in a time in which so many institutions in American life are collapsing, and when there's lack of public trust. And some of that is warranted because a lot of institutions have failed. But the Miller Center is a place of institutional excellence. And that's one of the reasons I keep coming back here, showing up. So thanks for the leadership that you've provided. I'm just going to make a few minutes of remarks, and Bill and I will have a conversation, and then we'll open it to Q&A. I wrote the book in about a year, but it's really the product of a lifetime in politics. What I've seen, the people that I've met, the mistakes that I've made, and the things that I've learned. It's not primarily a book about me, because I wanted to sell copies, and a book about me would not have. But it's in part about me and my journey, and I tried to be transparent in it. Since I was a kid, I've had two abiding passions. One is politics, the other is sports. Sports is more important, but politics is important too. And writing the book actually allowed me to think about what first drew me to politics, the ideas and the personalities, the human drama, the notion that ideas shape history. I had a sense at a pretty young age that something important and meaningful was at stake, and I think I was right about that. And after having spent my entire adult life in politics, serving in government, so 3 administrations, the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administration, the George W. Bush White House for 7 years, and a scholar at a variety of think tanks, I wanted to share with you my bottom line, which is I'm not cynical about politics, and I don't think you should be either. I need to quickly add that I'm not naive, I don't think, either. I've seen the dark side of politics. I know that there are imperfect people in politics, just like there are imperfect people in the medical profession, in the legal profession, and certified public accountants, and all sorts of other occupations. It's the nature of the human condition that we fail and that we fall, even as we also have the capacity for noble acts. And so politics has had its share of troubled souls. There's also with politics the particular danger, I would say, of the seduction of power. We see too much lack of courage and integrity, and too many people putting selfish interests above the national interests. I'm sure I've struggled with that myself. It's always easy to see the flaws in other people's motivations, and much harder to see the flaws in our own. And sometimes I think we're not even aware of what happens in our own motivation. So life is complicated. But I've also seen admirable people on both sides of the aisle. I know them, I've worked with them, and I respect many of them. And most of them are trying to do what's right most of the time. And they do get into politics because they want to make the country better. They don't always do it well, and they don't always do it with pure motives, to be sure. But they do get into politics, I think, for the right reason. And I'd say one of the dirty little secrets out there is that politics is broken because our country is broken. And if we change ourselves, we will end up changing our politics. We can get into more of that during the Q&A. But there is a falsehood out there, and it goes like this. All politicians are knaves and fools. They're unprincipled. They're corrupt. The problems we face are simple. The answers are obvious, and either stupidity or malice has to explain why solutions haven't been implemented yet. That's a fashionable view, but I don't think it's true. I don't think it aligns with reality. And I think that the broad sweep of history shows us that politics is filled with moments of grandeur and moments of squalor. Most of the time, frankly, it's something in between. More fundamentally, I'm not cynical about politics because politics is about justice, and justice always matters. You can't give up on politics, I don't think, in disgust or despair, because when we get our politics wrong, there can be a tremendous human cost to that. If we get it wrong, so much of what we love and know and stands to be swept away. And conversely, when we get politics right, it can lead to great human flourishing. So I'm not cynical about politics because I don't think it's warranted, and I'm not cynical because I don't think we can afford to be. We should be more hopeful than we are because we have more power than we think. And I would say it's fine to be a theoretical pessimist if you so choose, but you should be an operational optimist. Lord Charnwood, in what I think is the best of all the biographies on Lincoln, and I've read a lot of them, said of Lincoln that his own intense experience of the weakness of democracy did not sour him on it. He was too much of a patriot to allow that to happen. Now, in saying I'm not contemptuous of politics, I don't mean to say that I'm not worried about it. I am, and in the book I explain why I am. For now, I'll simply say that in many ways our politics is at a low ebb in the history of modern America. It's become a kind of transmission belt for lies and falsehoods. Large challenges aren't being addressed that need to be addressed. It's astonishing to me, I must say, the degree to which public policy these days is almost irrelevant to American politics. Politics is much too trivial and far too dehumanizing. It's become a kind of an arena for invective. The political leadership today is in many cases dismal, and in some cases cruel and pathologically dishonest. You can figure things out from there, but I'm happy to chat more about that. And Republicans and Democrats have contempt for each other in ways that that was not characteristic of previous times. Most striking to me is there's almost pulsating hatred for people who hold different views than we do. And we've shifted somewhere along the way to believe that people who disagree with us aren't just wrong, but they're corrupt. They're morally defective. People aren't listening to one another. Instead, we're too often shouting at one another. And sometimes it seems like we're living in different worlds and different universes, that we're dividing ourselves. The children of light and the children of darkness, sense that all truth resides with me, no truth resides with people on the other side. And so I think our political culture is sick right now. One person referred to it as a rock throwing contest, and a friend of mine says, it just seems like we're at each other's throats. I should say that I know of what I speak, because you can critique these things, but sometimes you get caught up in it. And I tell an anecdote in the book between me and Joe Klein, who's a journalist. I met Joe in the 1990s. He was a columnist. He was a wonderful writer, lovely writer, columnist for Newsweek. We became close friends. Joe was always a little more liberal than I was, but we shared a lot of mutual interests, several mutual friends, and we became quite close. And then I entered the George W. Bush administration. And make a long story short, I think Joe had the sense that I'd gone over to the dark side, and that the person he knew was not the person who was in the Bush administration. He had some fairly intense disagreements with what was happening. For my part, I felt like he was being unfair in some of his critiques of the administration. And he was being driven by a kind of a view of the administration that was unfair to it and to me, and so that was going on during the Bush presidency, and then after I left, it went public. He had written some things publicly that were critical of me. I responded. My justification at the time was, look, I've been attacked. I have every right to defend myself, and I'm going to do it, and I know how to do it if I have to. But the people who knew me best, most especially my wife Cindy, I think always knew that there was something not quite right about that it didn't settle well, and that's not how that relationship should end. So I tried a couple of times to get in touch with Joe, and then I wrote him an email. It was 2015, so this was years after I had left, to see if we could reconnect, and he agreed to. We had a very nice, actually, email exchange, and we met at the Jefferson Hotel. It's a few blocks from the White House, and probably fittingly, we came to the hotel at the same time from different directions. But we saw each other. Joe across the street. I was on the side of the Jefferson, and we actually embraced without saying a word. And then we had a lunch, breakfast actually, and it was a lovely breakfast, and the relationship was restored. But it took time. It wasn't easy. You have to be intentional. And the reason I just tell you that anecdote is because when I talk about the nature of politics and how easy it is to get pulled into things, I'm aware of that as well. Final point about American politics, while I'm worried about it, I'm not hopeless or fatalistic about it. And again, I don't think you should be too. My short advice to you and to me is to take the words of the novelist Flannery O'Connor. She wrote in one of her letters that we have to push as hard as the age that pushes against us. And I spend a fair amount of time in the book explaining what that means practically, what it means to take on the mantle of citizenship. I would just say, when thinking about the low state of our politics, I'd say several things, make several points. The first is, it seems to me important to keep context in mind. I think it's one of the afflictions of human nature, which is we think whatever moment we're in, it's the best or the worst that's ever occurred. We have historical amnesia. We have had far worse periods in American history than what we're going through now, I guarantee that. We've had far worse periods in American politics than what we're going through now. That election between Jefferson and Adams in 1800, which the Miller Center can tell you about, was a pretty nasty affair. A historian said that it almost tore apart the young republic. This is the first really contested election in American history, and it was a tough one. We had something called the Civil War, which 700,000 dead in a country of 29 million. So if you prorated it, as it were, that would be 7 million, the equivalent of 7 million deaths today. So it literally tore the country apart. The late 60s and early 70s, I'm a little young to really remember that period that well. But those of you who lived through it, or those of you who have read about it, there was a tremendously intense period of time. If you started it really, maybe the Watts riot, which was I think in '65, but really in the later part of the '60s, where you had the Vietnam War, the March on the Pentagon in the early '70s, Kent State. You had the sexual revolution, the generational divide. You had the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where there was blood in the streets. You had riots in universities. Students were violently taking over administration offices. And in the research of the book, I discovered that in a 18-month period between 71 and 72, there was an average of 5 domestic bombings a day in the United States. So there have been difficult times, and that's important to keep in mind. The second is that I'm a believer that often viruses can create their own antibodies, and that often in the life of an individual or a country, if you lose certain things that you once took for granted, but once you lose them, you begin to understand why you cherish them to begin with, and then you decide that you're going to fight for them, that they're worth reclaiming, restoring. And it may well be that this period in American politics, which is a difficult period, may give rise to a kind of civic renewal and a reminder to people why honor and decency and truth matter in American politics. The third thing I'd say is that we're citizens in a self-governing nation. That may sound self-evident, but I think sometimes we forget it. I think sometimes we think of ourselves like we're caught in currents we can't control, like a cork adrift in the ocean. But we actually have it within our capacity to shape our future and to write wonderful new chapters in the American story. It doesn't mean that we will do it. It's not foreordained, but it means we have the capacity to do it. That's one of the gifts and blessings of being a citizen in a democratic country. But we have to convince people that they need to be part of that effort. There's a lovely line in a poem by Wordsworth, The Prelude, which is an endlessly long poem. But one of the lines that Wordsworth has is, "What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how." And I think about that in the context of certain things that are worthy of our love, worthy of our esteem. Those things we have to love, and then we have to teach other people why they should love them as well. Just in conclusion, my first job in government was as a speechwriter. I was a deputy director of speechwriting for President Bush, so I have a weakness for speeches and for words. And one of my favorite speeches actually is by Bobby Kennedy. It was in South Africa in 1966. And the context of this was that was a huge trip that Kennedy took. It was a 5-day trip throughout South Africa. It was a big deal because no senator had ever gone to South Africa. This was during the height of apartheid. And Kennedy was a senator, but mostly he was a Kennedy. And that carried a lot of weight back then. And so he did a lot of meetings, gave several speeches, but there was one in particular where he was speaking to young people, mostly, and he warned against the dangers of futility, the belief that there is nothing one man or one woman can do against the enormous array of the world's ills, against misery and ignorance, injustice and violence. And then he added this: each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Now, we're not living in South Africa in 1966. We don't have to overthrow an apartheid regime, but the point still holds. We need to stand up for ideals. We need to act to improve the lot of others. We need to strike out against injustice where we find it, and when we do, those ripples of hope can create great currents of justice. So it was a delight to write the book, and thanks for honoring me with your presence here this morning, and I look forward to the conversation.
Well, the book really is a delight. It's beautifully written. I said to Pete when he walked in this morning, I also have this other view whenever I think about the book, which is I see blue ocean, and I read it on summer vacation, and so for me it just conjures great memories. Pete, before going into where the book takes us moving forward, I wanted to do a little bit more unpacking of some things in the book. Sure. So you talk about the death of politics stemming out of people's loss of faith, not just in government narrowly, but in a series of institutions. Help us understand that a little bit. If this was an autopsy, if the body is actually dead, or if it's a pathology, what happened?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think several things have happened. I think some institutions have failed people. I think people in politics have failed. In churches, you see the scandals that are plaguing the Catholic Church, Protestant churches, sexual abuse scandals, financial institutions. You had the 2008 financial crisis, so there was a sense that those institutions failed. So I think that is one of the factors, which is people have seen this in real lives. Institutions that they've been a part of or that are important, that they feel like have not lived up to their standards. Some people feel the same way about higher education or K through 12 education. Kids aren't getting educated. I think there's some merit in that. In some cases, I think there's a lot of merit in that. On the other hand, life is complicated. You can't make perfection the price of confidence either, and you do have to keep, as I was saying earlier, a historical perspective. So in many ways, if you look at some of the social indicators in American life, a number of things have gotten much better since, say, the late 80s and early 90s. Violent crime was roughly half of what it was in the early 90s. We're now down to rates of violent crime that was in the mid and early 1960s. Abortion, we're now at the lowest number of abortions per year since Roe v. Wade, 1973. Teen sexual activity is lower. And so we're seeing a movement on a number of fronts. Some of that is the result of institutions Some of it is a result of simply individuals changing their lives. I also think that there probably is a current of thought. There is I think it became fashionable to be cynical or distrustful of institutions. There's a kind of deep individualism, maybe radical individualism, that I think has taken root through many decades, that has caused people to create a kind of distance between them and institutions, and they don't feel a part of it. The third thing I'd say is I have a friend and former colleague, someone that you know, Yuval Levin, who's writing a book actually on the issue of institutions coming out next January called A Time to Build. And Yuval's insight, one of his insights, is that a lot of people have shifted their views of the purposes of institutions, that we used to view institutions as formative, as, in a sense, character shaping and soul shaping. But in recent years, people view institutions as performative, not formative. That is, they view these institutions not to shape our souls, but where individuals can get on platforms and perform. And I think you see that in a lot of different ones, including in Congress. So you have people, you'll know because you're more of an expert on this than I, but years ago there was a sense when you were new at Congress, you'd keep your mouth shut, you'd be a workhorse, not a show horse, you'd work your way up, you'd learn from other people, you'd learn from their experiences, you wouldn't go in thinking that you'd mastered everything. Today you get people coming in Congress who know hardly anything, have achieved hardly anything necessarily in their life, and they're out in some ways attacking the very institutions that they're a part of. They don't even speak as if they're a part of that institution. They decide that they want to criticize it, and there's a kind of nihilistic, or at least quasi-nihilistic, impulse that's going on. So I think all of those things have happened. I think probably also as an overlay here, there has been stagnant economic growth for pretty much this entire century. For reasons I don't put that blame on Democrats or Republicans or any particular presidents. I think these are certain deep currents that have happened. So we had gotten accustomed really from the mid part of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century to pretty robust economic growth, and that's just slowed down. And then you have things like income inequality. And when you combine income inequality with relatively stagnant growth, that has the prescription for unhappiness. And then the last thing I would say in terms of the feelings of antipathy and distemper in the land, we've had very high levels of legal immigration rates for many, many years now. Just to get my own cards on the table, I'm very pro-immigrant. I believe that's analytically where one should be. It's where my heart is. But I'm also aware enough about history to know that when you have some sustained periods of high immigration, that creates cultural difficulty for parts of a country. And you will often see the cycle of American history as high rates of immigration and then sense of that's enough, and then there are feelings of nativism pointing toward the other as the enemy, and assimilation has to occur. So I think there are a lot of deep sort of tectonic shifts that are going on in American society, and I think that it's manifesting itself in all sorts of ways, including in a feeling of unhappiness, antipathy toward other people, unhappiness toward politics generally, and institutions.
Pete, you do a wonderful job in laying out a path forward by focusing on what I call 4 heroes and a malevolent clown. And I want to do sort of an early speed round to work through the first 4 heroes. 3 of them happen to be human beings. And I thought they sort of wonderfully construct or reconstruct what I think had been sort of the beating heart of American conservatism and the Republican Party. So if you will, let's walk through them.
Sure.
So tell us about John Locke. Why is he important, and why should we re-embrace him?
Yeah. Well, Locke was viewed as, he was born across the pond, as they say, 17th century. He was viewed as the America's philosopher. He had a huge impact, more than anybody else, on the American founding. His contributions were severalfold. Interestingly, actually, on the issue of the attitude of religion and the state. Let me take that one first. Locke himself was a person of the Christian faith. He was very, very wary about conjoining and conflating faith and religion, not because he had
Faith in politics.
faith in politics, yeah. Not because he was a person who had antipathy for faith, but actually because he was worried what that conflation could do to faith. He was a product of his times. There had been basically 2 centuries of religious wars in the European continent. I think he understood, as the other founders understood, it gets complicated, and I'm happy to go into it more. There's certainly a place for faith in politics, and the founders understood it because their view was, to simplify things a little bit, they viewed faith as key and essential to the formation of human character. And that, because you're going to have a limited government, you're going to have people who embody a certain amount of virtues. That was on the positive side. I think on the negative side, one of the things they worried about, and this is what I would say is something that's plaguing us today, is that faith can bring with it deep passions. And politics has its own passions inherent in the political enterprise. If you overlay that with religious passions and you begin to sacralize politics, then you get into what I was talking about earlier, which is children of light, children of darkness. And so that's a danger. So that was one thing where Locke said we have to be very careful about that. The other one was that Locke was so essential in, one of the key figures in classical liberalism, which is rights precede government. And the role of government is to ensure rights. And that is what government is, and the government gets its legitimacy from the people themselves. And when government is out of sync with that, there have to be consequences. It was John Kennedy in his inaugural speech that said, I guess, the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. That was a very Lockean view of things. That we imbibe it now as part of our culture, our political culture. But at that time, that was a radical change, and he believed very much in government accountability.
So, sitting somewhat in tension with that, or maybe as a debating partner, but also an essential partner, is Aristotle. Tell us about Aristotle.
Yeah, well, Aristotle was the great Greek philosopher, wrote what's still probably the most important book on politics, The Politics. It's amazing to read it now, think about when he wrote it and how well it holds up. Aristotle's view, as in contrast with, I would say, with Locke's, he was much more of a product of his time and of a certain Greek philosophy, which was statecraft to soulcraft. It was so, you read how the Greeks understood what it meant to be a flourishing human being, and so much of that was being part of a political community. And they believed that politics had a real soul-shaping role, and more so than many of the founders did, although they weren't antithetical to one another. And Aristotle, too, believed in a certain accountability to the people in government, and had a very high view of government that still to this day helps inform how we think about it.
And so then Lincoln sits astride the two, a founder, if not the founder, certainly the first Republican president, but founder of the Republican Party. Why is he a hero in the book?
Yeah, I think, with all due respect to Mr. Jefferson, Lincoln is my favorite of all, not just of all American presidents. I think he was the greatest person that this country has ever produced for a variety of reasons. You're right, he really did, he was astride in a way of Locke and Aristotle. Locke was involved in politics, Aristotle not so much. Locke was primarily a thinker, Lincoln was primarily a practitioner. of politics. But he was a person who was deeply steeped in political theory and knowledge, person of enormous wisdom. He helped lead us through the most difficult time in American history. He was a person who embodied, I think, what I think of as great cardinal virtues and conservative virtues, which is prudence and wisdom. Lincoln's great insight, you have different people, Harry Jaffa and Gary Wills, debate whether Lincoln reinterpreted the founders or interpreted them correctly. But in any event, wherever you come out in that debate, he kept coming back to the founders as they were actually becoming kind of a distant memory to Americans at that time. And his great effort to abolish slavery was informed and succeeded because he kept tying it back, not to the Constitution, but to the Declaration, and that line, all men are created equal. And he referred to that as the sheet anchor of our nation. And so when he made his moral argument to why slavery had to be eliminated, it was because he kept coming back to what the founders said, what he believed that they meant, and gave it a kind of moral force that it would not otherwise have had. And then the last thing I'll say about Lincoln is it's just extraordinary to me when you read his inaugural addresses, and not only his inaugural addresses, the temperament and the disposition at the beginning and right before the war began, where he said we're not enemies but friends, and then at the end of the war, after that gruesome Civil War, where he said with malice toward none, with charity towards all, and that he decided to bring the South back in acts of healing rather than exact retribution on them. And that kind of charitable spirit, that kind of irenic approach was what the country needed then, and I think it needs it now. And I think he was maybe the greatest writer that certainly in American politics has ever produced, I would say.
So sort of the philosophical foundations of Locke, believing in individual rights and liberties is the foundation of everything we do, but almost the social sensibility of Aristotle.
Exactly.
And where does he come down on whether or not government can actually shape souls or not?
Yeah, I think he was somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. As I read Lincoln, he was not quite in the Aristotle view of statecraft, not quite as involved in soulcraft. He believed in limited government. He was a product of Locke and the founding generation. But he did believe that government had that capacity to shape the souls of citizens. And I am in that camp too. I think most people's souls are shaped by things far outside of politics, by the institutions we were talking about, families, communities, friendships, sports above all, faith. But politics teaches help shape people's souls too. One of the most obvious ways, it's an interesting thing when you hear people talk about politics and they say, that you shouldn't legislate your morality. And in one sense, we all understand what that means, because the assumption there is that this is a kind of rigid moralism that you don't want to, and we feel like live and let live, give people their space. So I get that. But of course, what are laws but legislating morality? It's a sense of saying this is right, this is wrong, this is what we esteem, this is what we oppose. And so law, by its own, almost by its very nature, it has a tutelary function in terms of morality. That's not true of all moral laws. I mean, there are some things that are happening, in various agencies that don't have an obvious moral dimension. But the great moments in American history were moral moments, and the law would both teach people and also be a manifestation of a certain moral view. And when Lincoln said, the great debate between Lincoln and Douglas, it's worth going back. Stephen Douglas was not a stupid person. He actually didn't argue outright for slavery. His argument was more sophisticated than that. It was popular sovereignty is what he said. He said, this is a democracy, right? Vote it up, vote it down. If the states in the West want slavery, that's up to them. That's what it means to be a self-governing country. That wasn't a stupid argument. It was a morally wrong argument, and Lincoln was able to take it on. And the reason that he took it on is he said, no, there are some things that you don't vote up, that you don't vote down. There's certain rights that we have, certain inherent dignity that people have, and you can't have a majority rule that just says, out with it, whatever we pass is right. By the way, Lincoln and the founders themselves, I think this is also opposite to this period, I'd say, I'd be interested if you agree, but I'd say probably in their top 3 or 4 areas of concern were the passions of the people. The reason that we have checks and balances in our system was this idea of cooling the passions of the people. That's why we don't have direct democracy. And Lincoln, as early as, he must have been 29 when he gave the Young Men's Lyceum speech, where he went very directly at the danger of when people's passions get stoked. They all knew that. They were brilliant interpreters of human nature. And the majesty of the American experiment when it works is to take human nature for what it is, which is to know it's a mixed bag capable of vices and virtues. How do you create institutions that channel those passions in ways that are constructive rather than destructive, that amplify the best of us and that mitigate against the worst? But they were not romantic idealists. They understood the dangers. You know, Madison, along with the others, but I guess primarily Madison, basically took Jefferson's library before they came up with the Constitution and studied every system of government that had preceded them and said, what are the dangers that we have to caution against? And that was one of them.
So the final hero is the truth. You spent a lot of time in the book talking about the truth, about the media. So first, Rorschach, what do you mean by the truth?
I mean objective reality. I mean that there are some things that are simply true, and they're true whether you one person says yes and one person says no. Mm-hmm. Certain facts that are facts and true to the nature of reality. And if you lose that, you lose a lot. And
how have we lost that? Give us your pathology, for instance, of our media. Where did this come from? And there's a connection to the nihilism that you talked about before in the motives of politics. But as we discuss events, we expect the media to do a certain amount of filtering. What happened to the filter? What happened to the media?
Well, I think some of what happened to the media is that it got broken up into tribalistic silos. Whatever you think of the media say, 90s, and I would argue that there was a general liberal bias toward the media in ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS at that time. There were exceptions. I think generally speaking, the mindset of most people, we know these from surveys, people who are journalists tend to be more liberal. I take it as a good faith argument that most journalists try to check that. I get that. Still, it influences your selection of stories and how you frame things. So I think some of that went on. But there was a certain understanding of that we were in the same galaxy of truth and facts. We're not there anymore. And I was to say, I mean, I just get my cards on the table. I have been a lifelong Republican up until around 3 years ago or so. But what is happening, I would say now primarily with the Republican Party, is as a party, it's engaged because of the president in not just a full-scale assault on truth, but an effort to annihilate categories of truth and falsity. I think that's one of the main challenges that we have in our politics. But back, you asked the question of the media. You all are familiar with this. You may even have to fight against it, but it's just extremely easy to get into your own silos. And you get just this feedback loop where all you hear is from people is the information that's affirming your preconceived notions. And you get this all of the time, and it just creates a distorted reality. and there's money in it, and there are ratings in it, but there's a huge cost to it, because the way I've described it before, we may have even you and I may have talked about this, but for most of my life in politics, I would say that what the difference between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and progressives, was that there were different paths to the same summit. Right, you would come at it in different ways, but we were aiming for the same summit. I'd say today it's almost as if they're two different mountains. People living in two different mountains, and you see it now playing out. I mean, as recently as this week, in the last few weeks, in the impeachment battle, where people are pushing fabrications and mythologies and conspiracy theories that simply are not true. And it doesn't matter how often you repeat a lie, it doesn't turn it into a truth. But I write in the book, a person who was influential to me and may have been to some of you, Václav Havel. Actually, Havel's writings when he was a dissident are more powerful to me than when he was the president of the Czech Republic, although both are worth reading. But he wrote an essay back in '79, I guess, called The Power and the Powerless. So this was when Czechoslovakia was under communist rule. It's a very powerful essay, and he's talking about the greengrocers and what it means to be a greengrocer, basically a citizen in a state, in a regime that's built on lies. And he talked about the corrupting effect of when the citizens begin to participate in the lies, even in small ways, putting up signs in front of their stores, saying things that weren't true. And he talked about living within the lie versus living within the truth. And if you live within the lie, just the utter soul-corrupting effects that it has, and that people had to stand up to straighten your backbone, I think he uses the phrase, and live with integrity. But when individuals begin to do that in their own individual lives, push back against the lies, then you can create a movement, because ultimately lies against the truth. If there are enough people with enough moral force on behalf of the truth, I don't think lies survive. Because I don't think ultimately human beings can live flourishing lives when they've given allegiance to a set of lies. I just think that ultimately that breaks down. But you need people with some degree of courage and persuasion to be able to make the case for truth.
So that brings us to the dead armadillos. There are, you're in a group, you're in several groups, but you belong to a cluster of writers, thinkers, public spokespeople, many of whom have served in government, that are broadly referred to as never-Trumpers. Conservative writers like George Will, Bill Kristol, and Mike Gerson, and the list is long.
Right.
So, where are you all today?
In a phone booth.
Do you have a sense of your impact at this point? Do you have a sense, and what is it like to be in that storm? I mean, we could spend an hour talking about that, and you touch on it in the book, but talk a little bit about the life of a never-Trumper right now.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the impact, I don't know. I mean, sometimes it feels like you're shooting BBs against a brick building, and they're just bouncing off. So I really don't know the impact, to be quite honest. And maybe it won't be measured until there's a post-Trump era, and we don't know if that's going to be in January 21st, 2021, or whether it's going to be after that. But at whatever point, that may be more manifest. In terms of our impact now on the Republican Party, not much. But that doesn't surprise me. I think if you go back and read my writings, and I was probably the earliest Republican to declare I would not vote for Trump under any circumstances. That was in the New York Times in January of 2016. Actually, my first article, this is kind of an interesting anecdote, my first article critical of Donald Trump was in July of 2015. It's 3 weeks after he'd gotten into the race, and it was called, I think it was President Trump, ? Just say no. Now, what's interesting is I found out later from my editor at the New York Times, a wonderful guy named Aaron Radica. He said that he had it was a real push to get that piece published because people thought, why are you writing a piece against Donald Trump? This guy's not going to go anywhere. He's going to dissolve within weeks. I didn't believe that. I didn't think he was going to win the 2016 election like most people. I think, have some understanding early on of the pernicious quality of him and his presidency and his effects on politics and on the country, and the resonance that he would have within the Republican Party, which I'm happy to go into more detail if you want. But I don't know. My view on these things, both in politics and in life generally, is you're not called to be successful. You're just called to be as faithful as you can be. And after that, it's often outside of our control.
So in the vein of being faithful, describe not necessarily the public impact, but the impact of the broader Trumpian conservative public on you. What is it? You've been writing a lot critical of the president over 3 years. This book, I refer in the review as having 3 heroes and a malevolent clown who keeps showing up and saying, I'm here. And you take him on in the book and elsewhere to the displeasure of friends, current and former, perhaps. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's no question. So the world that I came from was a world of Republican politics, and I'm a person of the Christian faith. Been mostly part of evangelical churches throughout most of my life. And evangelical Christians tend to be, generally speaking, conservative, and they certainly voted in overwhelming numbers for Donald Trump in 2016. So I guess I was a little unusual in the sense that if you were a critic of Trump and you were a liberal, that wouldn't have created any particular problems within your community. For me, it was a little bit different, and for the other people that you mentioned, Mike and Brett Stevens and George Will and some others. It's been an interesting experience.
You've used the word betrayal.
Yeah, I feel that two of the institutions that I've been a part of, was having a conversation actually with a couple of friends the other night about this. The Republican Party and actually the evangelical Christian movement, which was formative to me. It wasn't absolutely essential to me, and I never really got all that much identity, I don't think, from politics. I think probably because of my Christian faith. I've always had some limited amount of, I've tried to contain how definitional politics was to me, but it was important. Obviously a lot of colleagues, a lot of friends who have been part of it. And it created a lot of heat and some anger toward me. Not a huge amount, I would say, me toward them. I don't say that with any particular pride. I just think it's temperamental with me. But there have been times in which I've certainly been disappointed in people, some people more than others, and frustrated with some of what's going on. I've tried hard to keep the relationships together. I haven't really lost too many relationships during this period. But some of them are more distant. Some of them I've just had to make a prudential judgment, which is we're just going to have to keep things a little bit lighter and not politics now. We'll wait for the season to be. I'll tell you one anecdote which may or may not resonate with you, but in some ways it underscores a couple of points actually. So there's a person that Cindy and I went to church with in the late 90s. We were at National Pres at the time. And this was a woman and her husband that we knew. She liked us very much. I was, at that point, a conservative think tank called Empower America, which is Bill Bennett, Jack Kemp, Gene Kirkpatrick. Then I went into the Bush administration in 2001, and that all aligned with her politics. And so she was very happy about that, very happy to know me. Turned out she's a very strong Trump person. And she was on my distribution list where I send out articles. So during the campaign, it became pretty clear pretty early that she was not happy with what I was writing. And so I took her off my distribution list, not because as to exact any punishment. It's just if I feel like I'm sending things that are just provoking people and their heads are exploding, it's really no point in doing it. I don't want to do that to people. It's not particularly healthy. So we had a couple of exchanges. It was clear to me that it was going to be better suited. Anyway, to make a long story short, this was probably less than a year or so ago. Once in a while I listen to Christian worship songs, right? And so there was one called No Longer a Slave to Fear. So I linked to this song, as I periodically do, and I sent it to some people. I think sometimes you may have been on the receiving end of some of them. And I did a short email meditation on fear. And the upshot of what I wrote, I had a short paragraph in which I said, you know, fear seems to be pervasive today. And I said some of it is in politics. I said you see it with liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, pro-Trump, anti-Trump. They're all very fearful about what happens if the other side wins. And I said, but most of the fear that I've experienced with people is the fear that happens in individual lives, the illness that strikes someone that you love, the alienation of a child, the loss of a job. That is really what generates most fear. And so I wrote that. And I actually intentionally sent it to her because I thought, well, maybe this will reconnect us in a non-political sphere. So she wrote me back this really angry email. She said, you know, Trump is living rent-free in your head. You're probably, you know, being funded by him, by anti-Trump forces. The way you had the contempt that you have for those of us who are pro-Trump, just going on and on. And so a few years ago, I would have written something back that was different than what I did, but I waited and I wrote back and I said, so-and-so, just very quickly, let me just quote what I said. And I said, you weren't reacting to this. You must have been reacting to something else, maybe something I've written or other things that are out there. But I said, you know, it really would be a shame if that relationship that we had that was based on something other than politics was shattered because of politics. So why don't we get together for lunch? We met at Jay Gilbert's in McLean, which is where I live. And I said, we're not going to change each other's opinions of Trump, but maybe we'll be able to hear each other a little bit better, understand each other's perspective a little bit better. And so she wrote a very nice note back, actually, and we had lunch. Most of the lunch was kind of catching up, wasn't politics. I'd say 70% of the lunch was me just asking her questions. And apropos what you were saying earlier, I said, you know, what do you listen to? Where do you get your news? Who do you read? And based on what she listened to from morning to night, I understood her world. It was just straight kind of, you know, right into the veins of a certain view, a certain set of facts that shaped her kind of reality. And so it was nice and it was warm, but again, it just took real effort. And I do think that the degree to which, on a micro scale and probably on a macro scale, we can, and I haven't done this nearly often enough, but that we listen to each other better and listen to each other's perspectives, not because we're going to necessarily change each other's minds, but to know that people are products of their life experience, families of origin, a different hierarchy of values. Jonathan Haidt at NYU has written a wonderful book called The Righteous Mind, used to be here at UVA, about how liberals and conservatives have different hierarchy of values which informs their politics. I think that kind of thing can go a long way. But being long-winded, you know, it's somewhat isolating when you have these institutions that you believed in, and you think from your perspective that they failed you or betrayed certain ideals that you've had. But those things can change, and the people that inhabit those institutions aren't malevolent, certainly for the most part. I mean, obviously there are malevolent people in every institution. But I do think they're making a mistake, and I think that they're doing real injury to the country, and so that's a painful thing.
So why don't we go to questions from the audience? And Bunny has the microphone in the back, over here on the left.
Thank you for an excellent presentation, and
Thanks.
especially helping us to think about the complexity of issues. And we're so caught up in our partisan, simplistic viewpoints sometimes. And in that regard, you mentioned the media and the idea that we're so often in our different galaxies and our different silos, and people often make that argument, and they'll say that I can turn on television at the prime hours, and I can see Rachel Maddow and O'Donnell, or I can see Hannity and,
Right.
And so on. And others say, no, that's a false equivalence, that there are differences in the treatment of facts and all that. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, I do. I think it's fair. I do think that there is a difference between the two. I would say that Fox News now and a lot of conservative talk radio, and I've had friends in those worlds and have been a part of them and know some of the people pretty well over the years. I think that they are putting forth a series of lies and conspiracy theories that are more problematic and more acute than the liberal side of things. And I say that not with any particular relish, because as I say, these are people that I've known, and these are, networks that I've appeared on before, and I felt like when conservative talk radio first started, I thought there was actually a useful function for it, and Fox News, when it first started, I thought there was a useful function, because I do feel like there was a kind of monolithic grip that liberalism had on the media, and it was useful to have a different point of view. I didn't anticipate that it would go in the direction that it has. Now, having said that, I do think that in all of these networks and in the media generally, and this is not true as much, I would say, for newspapers as it is for the television shows and the cable shows, because those shows get ratings based on conflict, really. Now there's some, like the News Hour, which I like very much. I think Judy Woodruff does a great job there. And like probably most people in this audience, Brooks and Shields is kind of cool. I like them, and I like both men, and I like their perspective. If you go through, there are certain reporters like Peter Baker at the New York Times or Phil Rucker at the Washington Post who are just really good, and I would say you should read them. Some of those papers have slants. They come at things from a certain way. They interpret things in a particular way. I think they're good. But I do think that as a general matter, what would be more helpful, and I don't have any magic wand or any deep insight on how you would achieve this, but even on on all of the cable news shows, this relentless advocacy for the same side, rather than trying to find out how you can help people see the other perspective. I just think that's more of what we need as a country. I just think we need to understand each other more. So if you're a critic like Trump, as I am, and a very public one, the danger for me is that I just write off everybody who's a pro-Trump supporter and think that, again, what I was saying earlier, that they're malicious, they want to hurt the country, they're stupid, they're this or they're that. That's not the case. I think they're wrong, and I've been singing that song for a lot of the last several years, and I try and make, I hope, a reasonably reasoned case for why I think they're wrong. But they're not bad people. They do have some grievances which are worth listening to. A lot of the people who are Trump supporters feel like, I don't know, do you know Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist at Berkeley? She wrote a really interesting book called Strangers in Their Own Land. She wrote this about the Tea Party. So she went down to Louisiana several years ago to try and understand the Tea Party movement. She's a sociologist at Berkeley, so she's liberal. She really developed an affection for the people. She went to the Bayou country in Louisiana, right? So kind of dead center for that point of view. She's developed a real affection for the people there, human relationships. She didn't agree with them politically. But I did a panel session with her. This is like a few days or a week before the 2016 election. We were out at Stanford, and I went over in a car with her to do the event. And she told me, I still remember, she said, Pete, the thing you have to understand about the Trump supporters is that they feel dishonored and they feel humiliated. And she said, he is a tonic to their depression. And that was helpful to me, and I understood it, because I understood if you were a person of certain traditional beliefs on maybe sexual ethics or certain current within the Christian community, you felt like the elite culture looked down at you for years and years and laughed at you and mocked your beliefs and pretended that what you believed in was driven by bigotry, when people are trying to be faithful to for them, the Scripture. Now, they may be wrong in how they interpret it, but they're not motivated by that. So, you know, that kind of thing, what Arlie Hochschild said to me, is helpful. And I think our media, or so much of our media right now, is just each side amping up and making you feel more righteous or self-righteous and thinking, God, you know, those people really are stupid that believe the opposite. But how you get there, I don't know. I'm sure if it was a ratings winner, more people would do it, but it's not, and so that's a challenge.
Student here in the front.
Thank you for coming.
Sure.
A little bit of a follow-up on that question. You've spoke a lot about the power of sharing your convictions with other people, like with that journalist you spoke to and your Trump supporting friend. And I tend to think that people are not as divided as this hyper-partisan atmosphere may make it seem. But given the media environment is not all that conducive to having these conversations, are there any leaders out there that you think can help lead us to a more friendly and welcoming atmosphere to have these conversations?
It's a good question. Let me just pause a second on what you said, because there's an important point in it. I was talking a bit to Bill Galston, who's a former colleague of yours. Bill is a political theorist, used to be at University of Maryland, now is at Brookings, worked in the Clinton administration. Bill's a friend, both of ours. And Bill was making an important point, and he said that you have to distinguish between cognitive polarization and affective polarization. That is, our differences on the issues is not as large as many people think, right? So if you went through, I don't know, take your issue, immigration, there's actually more common ground than you probably would think, given the environment. What there is this affective polarization, this emotional polarization, and it's the sense of sort of tribalism. So the feelings are so intense, the antipathy is so deep, that people think that the folks on the other side want to destroy the country, and one of the products of that is that they caricature what the views of the other side have. So if we could get more toward the actual reality of things, which is the differences on policies are not as great as they may appear, and turn the temperature down on the affective polarization. There's a group, by the way, it's a really interesting group, if you're not familiar with it, called Better Angels. A guy named David Blankenhorn runs it. And they go around there, I think they're in 49 states now, and they go around and have these sessions with people who are red and blue state, Republicans, Democrats. And it's the effort, the wisdom of this is they're not trying to overcome differences. I would argue that too often we think in terms of we've got to get more bipartisan support so we all agree with each other. The problem is that we disagree. We've always had differences in American politics. We always will. It's just part of the human experience. What we've lost is the capacity to navigate those differences. That is, how do you as a pluralistic country treat each other and deal with politics in a way that takes into account the differences. So anyway, I wanted to say that. In terms of leaders out there who could help us, right now I would say, figuratively, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to take the knife out of the body. So as long as Donald Trump is president, we're not going to get over this period of division in American politics. There have been other divisive presidents for sure in American politics. And the polarization in American politics is not a product of Donald Trump. These trends were in motion long before him. You know, Clinton was more polarizing than Bush 41. Bush 43 was more polarizing than Clinton. Obama was more polarizing than Bush. Trump is more polarizing than Obama. So these trends have been going on for a while. And there have been presidents that have been polarized. And polarization per se is not even wrong. It depends on polarization for what purpose. If you divide people in the pursuit of justice, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. was a polarizing figure. So was Ronald Reagan. So was Lincoln. So I'm not prepared to say that polarization or division is always wrong. It depends on what the purposes are. But we've never had anybody as president who seems to take a psychic delight in dividing the public, who so intentionally does it, and is purposeful and intentional in it. Now, as long as that happens, we're just not going to get very far away, or we're not going to make very much progress. At whatever point he ceases to be president, then I think the healing can begin on that scale. You know, who's out there? I mean, virtually anybody would be better than he is right now. I'll say that. Are there certain people? You know, in the Republican Party, I'm fond of Ben Sasse as a senator in Nebraska. I think he's a very thoughtful guy, very reasoned guy, and Chris Coons, who's a Democrat from Delaware. So those would be two figures that I would say are impressive. I think Mitt Romney has been very impressive during this period. He's the one Republican senator who's willing to speak out. The trouble with the Republican Party, and I've got obviously friends who are Republicans, people I know in Congress who used to be in Congress. I've made my objections known to them in terms of their stance. You know, the problem right now is, in one sense, it's less Donald Trump than it's the pathologies of the Republican Party. I know that there would be Republicans that would speak out more against Donald Trump if they didn't feel like that their base would turn against them. If it were just Donald Trump, they could take that. The trouble is Trump represents what I think is a pathology on the American right. And so if you speak up against him, you're targeted and you may be eliminated as a political figure. You can ask Mark Sanford, you can ask Jeff Flake, you can ask Bob Corker. Now in the end, I think politicians should stand up to him anyway. And that's why I'm glad Mitt Romney is doing that. But there is a cost. And I'll say one other thing, which is I think what we need more of is political leaders within their own party who are willing to speak to the extremism or the transgressions of your own party. What never works is one party leader speaking to the other. So if Obama is lecturing Republicans on civility, or George W. Bush is lecturing Democrats on decency, that not only doesn't work, it makes things worse, because it gets the other party's back up. They don't want to be lectured to by someone that they think is their opponent. The first reaction is always hypocrisy. Why are you lecturing us? Why don't you lecture your side? That doesn't work. If you had more leaders who the party and the members of the party had invested in, and they had a certain moral authority, and they said, look, you're part of my team, we agree on a lot of things, but this is just wrong, or you just shouldn't say this, or you just shouldn't do this. That, I think, would go some distance toward healing the breach.
We are at time, and so why don't you give me one quick question in the form of a question, please?
Enjoyable discussion.
Thanks.
You mentioned we are products of our upbringing and how we go forward. I grew up in Venezuela, and I can tell
we get
you
a question,
that
please,
the very
'cause we're
okay,
short on time.
Sure. The very simple situation was the media, in terms of the accuracy of what the Venezuelan people were being fed, and which resulted in present-day destruction of that country.
Right.
I feel like this is another repeat of that in my life, in this country. My background is in science. Would not a simple solution would be you mentioned the media sources, to simply do a track record. They all have a track record, each media source, of stories that were falsely promoted and then retracted, stories that we later find they have quashed. Wouldn't that be an indicator of who we should be paying attention to as as a good media source and value of information? Because our founder here, and I'm an alumnus of this university, very simply said, a healthy democracy is dependent on an informed and educated citizenry.
Right.
We have a very poorly informed and somewhat, as you mentioned earlier, educated citizenry. So again, it's a simple solution.
Got it. So let me try and untangle this. It's a good question. I don't think it's a simple solution. Let me say that at the outset. I appreciate what you said. No, I understand. I'll get to it. I don't think it's a bad idea. I just don't think it's a simple solution, and I'll tell you why. First thing I'll say is I'm familiar, not as familiar as you are, with what's happened in Venezuela, and I think it's a cautionary tale. I do think that this country, for a whole variety of reasons, is not on the edge of being Venezuela or any of a number of other countries. You hear, for example, thrown out way too often analogies to the Nazi regime. I tend to once you play in the Hitler card, you're probably not doing a good thing as a general matter. Partly because just invoking it creates all sorts of cognitive reactions that we don't need. This country is just different. The institutions are much stronger than they are in most countries. I think the wisdom of the founders, you're seeing particularly at moments like this, because the founders had in part in mind this kind of moment, which is what happens if you get a bad leader, and how do you create political institutions that can help us get through it. That's the genius of checks and balances. So that's one. Second, we know this from the research that if you just point out, you say, look, if you go to InfoWars and Alex Jones and say this is a conspiracy theorist, for those people who listen to Alex Jones, it doesn't matter. It simply confirms the idea that the conspiracy is true because all these other people are saying that he's a conspiracy theorist. I've said before that in this particular moment in American politics, it's much more important, I think, to have a deep understanding of psychology than to have a deep understanding of politics. I don't think you can understand this moment through the political realm or through even a cognitive realm. I think much of what's happening is psychology, and there's a whole body of literature on what happens in tribalistic politics and why certain arguments don't make a difference, and why if you point out that certain media outlets have a bad track record, it doesn't change the mind of the people who are following those things because they dismiss it. Because they've created a psychological, I wrote a piece recently where I talked about the psychology of accommodation. What happens when you, in this particular case, you're a Republican, you had a whole set of ideals and principles that you stood for, which Donald Trump, in some pretty obvious ways, is living against, right? Or let's say if you're an evangelical Christian who took tremendous amount of delight and airtime talking about the centrality of moral leadership in presidents around about 1998 or so, when Bill Clinton was president. And then when Donald Trump comes around, you've sort of discovered that we're electing a president, not a pastor. And we're all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And don't we believe in forgiveness and grace? So the very people who are making the moral critique against Bill Clinton back in the late 90s and saying, be careful about Bonhoeffer's cheap grace and righteousness actually matters, have now flipped that around. And I will say Democrats, women, feminists who used to care a lot about being a sexual predator, when the guy that was a liberal was president, they decided, we can overlook that. And the economy is really good. So we can take a scoundrel in the White House as long as he's advancing the causes we care about. Well, those people have all of a sudden discovered in the Trump era that morality matters. So we're all susceptible to this. But the psychology of accommodation, if you're dealing with, say, white evangelicals, just to take them as a group I know pretty well, who once believed certain things, Trump comes up, this creates, in one sense, a tremendous cognitive dissonance. You are living in some respects at odds with what you've talked about. Even though you're supporting Trump, you think, because he's going to advance policies that you think advance the common good. That's their argument, that the country will be injured in a way if Trump's opponents win more than if he wins. So that's the starting point. But then you say to these people, but can you see the moral and ethical transgressions that this person is doing? Can you at least admit to that? And I'm telling you, it's like asking people to look into the sun. They can't do it. They'll glance away. They'll immediately change the subject. They'll say, well, the left wants to do this. Or they'll downplay what he's done. You know, hey, he's a little rough around the edges. Got it. Okay, so he sends out tweets that are problematic. It's like, nah, it's a little worse than that, don't you think? No. That's what the psychology of accommodation does, because people can't live with cognitive dissonance very easily. And so what you end up doing is you create a whole series, as we're all susceptible to this, of rationales and explanations, and you begin to downplay the things that's causing the cognitive dissonance. You begin to become part of a community who sees things the same way that you do. So you begin to reinforce to each other your own righteousness and the unrighteousness of the other people. And then you target the people who are making you uncomfortable. So the people who are calling you out, who are speaking to the truth, particularly if they're from your own tribe. So if they used to be in your tribe and they're calling you accountable, then those people become targets because there's a view you're a traitor. The other people, at least, Nancy Pelosi, she's always been a liberal Democrat, so we don't expect much from her. But you used to know better, and now you're a tool of the left. And now the people who want to destroy us, that we hate, you're part of that team, and you have to suffer. So that whole kind of psychological and cognitive dance that people go through is extremely complicated. I've talked to a number of psychologists, clinical psychologists, to try and understand what's going on. I think understanding Donald Trump's psychology is pretty easy, frankly. He's a narcissistic personality disorder, probably he has elements of sociopathy. He's a person without any moral center. That's so obvious, I think, to anybody with eyes to see and ears to hear. And it's true of his entire life. Asking Donald Trump to understand morality is like asking a person who was born colorblind to understand color. They can't do it. So for him, I think he's genuinely puzzled if you said you can't call up the leader of a foreign country and hold up aid unless they investigate your political opponent, because it's wrong. I think, honestly, if you give them a lie detector test, it's wrong. Why not? I have to do it it's to advance my interests. So that, I don't think, is complicated to understand. I think it's pernicious, but I don't think it's complicated. What's more interesting to me, more complicated, is the psychology of accommodation among his supporters who at least once upon a time did know better. But because of the tribalistic impulses that exist, they've decided, we're all in and we've got to defend him of all costs. That's the challenge. But again, those challenges can be overcome, and that's really up to us in our individual lives and our collective lives to speak truth, to talk about why politics of honor and decency matter, and to do it with some degree of winsomeness, and to sort of invite people back into a world that they once knew, and a world that does allow for the human good and human flourishing.
I started out the event with the words moral courage, and when you read the book, which I encourage you to do, you will see it on every page. But I want to end with the word grace. Peter does it with such terrific grace, sympathy, empathy that it's really just a stunning accomplishment. So Peter, thank you.
God, thanks. Thanks for having me. Thanks for doing it.
I want to let Peter out, so as soon as I finish thanking some folks, we'll let Peter go because he has books to sign and books to sell. But I first do want to thank a bunch of people. This is the last event of the calendar year. We have such a terrific team here, starting with Christina, who organizes so many of these events every year, including the vagaries of scheduling and late-minute cancellations. Next week's event, for anyone who's planning to come see Steve Gillen, we've had to postpone because of a family issue for Steve. And this is a day in the life that Christina manages, including managing all of us. So big thanks to her. To Bunny, Margaret, Catherine, our student in the back who usually is carrying the microphone around, Mike, Rob, Kevin, Woody, Karen, June, and I'm sure I've forgotten somebody, Alfred, usually signing people in. So if you see them, please thank them for their work this year. And 2 programming notes for the new year, just to keep you excited and interested in coming back. On January 16th, Melody Barnes is going to be recording a podcast for a series under the Democracy Initiative, and this one will be on the Great Society. And then on January 31st, we're going to be reintroducing our newest faculty member of the center, Shirley Lin, and also another new member, Evan Feigenbaum, who is our Schlesinger professor, served on East Asia issues in the Bush 43 administration and is now the executive vice president at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace in Washington. And Harry Harding, who I see in the back of the room, will moderate that conversation. That's on January 31st, and on the topic is China. 1 or 2 things going on in China these days that I'm sure will still be happening in some form on January 31st. So with that, thanks to all of you for a great 2019 and looking forward to what I'm sure will be an eventful 2020.
Thanks for doing that.
Why don't we let